Republican Leader.
Earlier this year, the Democrats who run Washington promised America things would be different under a re-elected President Obama. Instead of politics, they'd focus on policy. Instead of leaving everything until the last minute, they'd get the people's work done ahead of time for a change and through the regular order. Well, those promises didn't last very long. Later this afternoon, less than 24 hours before the President's sequester proposal takes effect, we will vote on a Senate Democratic plan that does more to perpetuate the culture of irresponsibility around here than it does to fix a culture of spending that Washington Democrats claim to be concerned about. Point of fact, not only would their legislation fail to fix the spending problem facing our country, it would actually add billions more to the deficit. In other words, it isn't a plan at all. It's a gimmick. Top Democrats already concede it will never garner enough votes to pass the very legislative body they control, much less the House. But let's be very clear, for the President and for his allies, that's really the whole point. They want it to fail, so they can go around the country blaming Republicans for a sequester the President himself proposed. In fact, they're so concerned about preventing anything from actually passing the Congress that they've limited the ability of senators on both sides to debate the issue openly and to offer different ideas. For instance, Senators Ayotte and Paul have introduced bills that deserve our consideration. And there are others, too. Senator Collins has been working on a proposal, and Senator Whitehouse has a plan that would replace the sequester with a series of huge tax hikes. I don't support that approach, but his legislation at least merits a vote. Republicans will get just one chance to offer a bill, and I'll discuss that legislation a little later in my remarks. But if the President's sequester is going to be as horrible as Washington Democrats have proposed, shouldn't we spend more than just a few hours debating it? Is this really the best Senate Democrats can do? As for the President, he too has yet to put forward a serious plan that could pass either the House or the Democratic-controlled Senate. And he's refused to engage in substantive discussions with congressional leaders. Now this week, he finally invited Speaker Boehner and me to discuss the sequester. That's tomorrow, the day it takes effect. In short, instead of changing as they promised, Washington Democrats are just turning back to the same old campaign-first strategy they've employed literally now for years. And now, after thwarting every bipartisan attempt to avert the sequester, the President is ready to make it bite as hard as possible, all to send a simple message to the public. You want to control Washington spending, America? Fine. Let me show you how much I can make it hurt. That's the President's strategy. Let me show you how much I can make it hurt. Instead of directing his cabinet secretaries to trim waste in their departments, he's going after first responders and teachers and almost any other sympathetic constituency you can think of. And he'll arbitrarily close parks and monuments too, all to force Americans to accept higher taxes. And he'll claim his hands are tied. He'll say he has no choice but to release criminals into the streets and withhold vaccinations from poor children. And somehow it'll be everybody's fault but his. Nonsense. Look, our country has a spending problem, a pretty massive one. Most of us in the chamber at least acknowledge that fact. But we can either address the problem in a smart way or we can do it in the way he's proposed. And that's what the Toomey-Inhofe legislation we'll vote on this afternoon is all about. It's about giving agency heads greater flexibility to ensure the sequester cuts are implemented in a smarter way. Some have raised concerns that this would give the administration too much power, that the President would just use the authority to punish his critics. I certainly understand those concerns. But the goal here is twofold. One, to make sure the American people get the same amount of spending cuts that were promised to them in 2011, and two, to guarantee some accountability on the President's part so that those cuts are administered in a more intelligent way. Now, you'd think the President would welcome a proposal like ours. Given his complaints and those of his cabinet secretaries about their hands being tied on cuts, you'd think he'd be banging on our doors demanding flexibility. But now, get this. He's complaining that having extra authority might mean he'd actually have to choose which programs to preserve and which ones to cut, that he'd have to prioritize spending within the federal government. Well, with due respect, Mr. President, I think a lot of people who voted for you think that's your job to make those tough decisions, especially tough decisions to implement the plan you yourself proposed and insisted upon. Surely you can find a little more than 2% to cut from the federal budget. And surely you can do it without raining down a phony Armageddon on American families. They had to find ways to cope with the 2% less in their paychecks just last month after the payroll tax went back up. Why in the world can't Washington? Look, the American people will simply not accept replacing spending cuts agreed to by both parties with tax hikes. And I plan to make all of this clear to the President when I meet with him tomorrow. He already got hundreds of billions of dollars in new revenue earlier this year when the tax law expired. Now it's time for the balanced part of the equation. And that means keeping our promise to reduce spending. So the times for games is over. No more protecting waste and broken promises at the expense of those who actually need government help. The American people were promised more spending control, and Republicans are going to help them see that that promise is fulfilled, and in the smartest way possible.